Thank you for joining us. We're here today with Ellen Armour. Ellen is the author of a new book titled Seeing and Believing: Religion, Digital Visual Culture, and Social Justice. She's the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Chair and Professor of Feminist Theology at Vanderbilt Divinity School, where she also directs the Carpenter Program in Religion, Gender, and Sexuality. Her previous books include Signs and Wonders: Theology After Modernity. Ellen began her teaching career at Rhodes College in Memphis. While at Rhodes, she served as chair of the Religious Studies Department and of several major faculty committees. She was honored to receive the Clarence Day Dean's Award for Outstanding Teaching and the Jameson Jones Award for Faculty Service. She joined the Vanderbilt Divinity School faculty in the fall 2006 and has served in various leadership roles during her time there and became the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in the fall of 2019. So Ellen, thanks so much for joining us, and many congratulations on all of your great work.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. I'm excited to be here. This is going to be a fun conversation, I'm sure.
Yes, I mean, I've been looking forward to it too. This is a unique title, a unique subject, that you're
Mhm.
writing about. So, I'm interested in diving into it.
Yeah, happy
But
to.
before we get to the book, I mean, what else would
Yeah.
you like people to know about you?
I think you've covered it pretty well. I've gotten, my work has been kind of interesting. I'm always responding in some way, shape, or form to something that really that seems to me to be an urgent problem, a current urgent problem. But all those current urgent problems tend to have roots in the past. And so do that mix of things of trying to understand better the roots of our current problem, whatever it is that I want to address, and then bringing the resources of Christian theology to bear on it has really been, what I've tried to do for forever. So that this is another instance of it, I think.
Good, good. So before we get into the new book, can you talk about the previous books that you've written?
Sure. My first book was based on my doctoral dissertation, and it was looking at the particular problem of just kind of what I came to call white feminism's difficulty dealing with race and really acknowledging it deeply. And it uses one of the things I do a lot of is use a lot of continental philosophy. So philosophy mostly from France. And in this case, the philosopher Jacques Derrida was a really important figure for me, as well as so-called French feminisms or French feminists. But also a lot of literary scholars too, African American literary scholars in particular, and womanist theologians and ethicists in the world of Christian theology. Those two are Black women who you don't know if you're familiar with Alice Walker's definition of womanish,
Mm-hmm.
right? That woman and that kind of sassy is a certain way to kind of shorthand for womanish, and womanists adopted that term and often say that womanism is to feminism like purple is to lavender. So kind of deepening
Mm-hmm.
feminism by paying more attention to race than and other issues in some cases too than white feminists have traditionally done. So that was my first book.
Mm-hmm.
My second book is the one you mentioned, Signs and Wonders, Theology After Modernity. That one, it started out as a kind of really ambitious project, but it ended up being anchored in photographs that you would recognize, anybody would recognize, from 2003 to 2005. I talked about, and again, remember, I'm always interested in urgent matters. So the photographs that I talked about were of the consecration of the Reverend Gene Robinson as the first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church, or the Anglican Church, I guess I should say. And then two photographs from Abu Ghraib, the Abu Ghraib torture archive, as it came to be called. And then two stills from the video that, or family movie, really, essentially, that Terry Schiavo's parents shared
Mm-hmm.
in advocating for her. And then finally, two photos from Hurricane Katrina, which was, you'll remember, a really major
Yeah.
disaster. As I say, I got to those photographs by virtue of, just the urgency of those issues that just kind of pulled on me. And I felt like I've got to talk about that. But I had never written about photographs before. And so I felt like I didn't want to treat them as just objects present to hand, so to speak. I wanted to really understand photography. So I reached out to a friend and colleague of mine at Rhodes, former colleague at Rhodes, who's an art historian, and said, send me stuff that I should read.
Mm.
And he did. And I educated myself, really did a deep dive on it. And to back up a second, I said, that I had this kind of very ambitious idea, which was that I wanted to argue that that one way of thinking about modernity, and this now has to do with the subtitle of the book, that one way of thinking about modernity was in terms of what I called a fourfold, which is a term I got from another philosopher, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, of man and his others. And by man, I meant just kind of the Enlightenment subject, white male, white cis het male, I guess we would say now, normatively speaking. Then his sexed and raced others, his animal other, and his divine other. And that these four are arranged in a kind of circle of sorts, with each one a kind of hall of mirrors, with each one reflecting the other back to themselves. And that had really kind of been a generative force in some ways, or generative organizing principle in modernity. And that what that organizing principle had built was beginning to disintegrate. And we were struggling to bear up under that disintegration and give birth to whatever was going to take its place. That was my big giant scheme. And I took that to my editor at the time and said, what about this? And he said, that sounds great, but we're going to need a first chapter. And I'm like, okay. So I tried a first chapter where I was like, okay, I'll just talk about the history of modernity from Descartes to now. Well, you can imagine how that went. That was a complete disaster. So at that point, I was like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. So I decided then, I'd abandon that and I would go do my deep dive into photography. And when I did and did this deep dive into the history of photography, how it came to be, how it was understood, how it was practiced when it first started out, by golly, I kid you not, my fourfold of man and his others was all over that history.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, so you talk about a God moment. Maybe that was what, and it led me to an insight where I thought, oh, I know how I can do this. I can ground this not in the philosophers I'd used before, but in the work of another French philosopher, Michel Foucault. I'll spare you the details about Foucault, but that's what I did. Now, of course, I hadn't written about Foucault either. So I had taught him for a long time, but never written about him. So I had to educate myself on that too. So in a sense, that's what Signs and Wonders was trying to do. That's where my kind of obsession, if you will, with photography came from. Because I really thought when I finished Signs and Wonders that I was done with photographs, right? I thought that was the end. But it turned out I wasn't. I just couldn't let go of them. And in part because of, again, the role that photographs were playing in our virtual lives and our real lives in now these days, and particularly in and around issues of social justice. So the kind of genesis for this book was...
New book. You're talking about the new book now, right?
Now the new book,
yeah,
Seeing and
Believing.
Yeah, right. And the genesis for the new book was recognizing that photographs were still controversial and important resource, I guess you could say, in the struggle for social justice. And it is a struggle, right? You can think, for example, of the videos of police killings of Black men, right? Just as a prime example. So that just kind of led me. I was like, I can't quit the photography bug. And so what I did with this book is basically update, if you will, what I'd done in Signs and Wonders, because I hadn't paid a whole lot of attention to the digital world in Signs and Wonders, a little bit, but not much. And so that's what I did for this one, was kind of update it. And what I found was a fair amount of what I had said about photography in the first book still applied to the digital realm. But, and in some ways it had been accelerated and amplified by the digital world. But still there were things I needed to talk about. So that's what I did. I did the kind of deep dive into into understanding what I call digital visual culture.
Hmm. And so what would you say is the primary theme of the book?
That's a good question. I guess I would say the primary theme of the book is this. I want people, and particularly, I guess you could say this is a book that's addressed to good white people, kind of like us, right? People who don't consider themselves racist, don't consider themselves sexist, don't consider themselves homophobic, transphobic, etc. Um, and who are kind of maybe struggling to find their place in relationship to some of these issues around social justice. I'm thinking particularly about what happened in the wake of the killing of Michael Brown, and how many people, including big group of people in my neighborhood, all white, almost all white, one or two Black people in the neighborhood who did it, joined reading groups where we tried to read books like Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, or White Fragility, right? And so what I want to do is try to marshal that goodness, right, that's present in that community that I identify with too, and see if I can't help us recognize the challenges and opportunities that come with the virtual world, and figure out how we can navigate those challenges and opportunities more ethically, more profoundly, in ways that support the struggle for social justice, those various struggles for social justice. And I'm talking about good white people at the moment, but I do intend this to, apply to lots of other people too. Communities, and again, depending on the issue at hand, disability rights, racism against Asian Americans, not just anti-Black racism, a kind of, really amplification we're going through right now of what oppression, injustice against trans people in particular. So, the communities are going to vary a good bit. So I'm hoping that this strategy, what I do here by exploring those challenges and opportunities, and then offering a strategy for how to navigate them that I get from religion, will be useful and helpful to folks.
Interesting.
That's a long answer, but yeah.
So I'd like to read a couple of the endorsements of the book. This one's from our friend, Professor Kate Ott, author of Sex, Tech, and Faith, Ethics in a Digital Age. She says, "Seeing and Believing is a meticulous and engaging portrait of how digital technology, especially social media, affects society. Never abstracting or ignoring the gaze of whiteness and seeking social justice, Armour shows the reader how photographic insurrection can upend oppressive relationships generated by biodisciplinary powers." So can you explain what photographic insurrection is?
Sure. So I'm going to go back to Signs and Wonders for a minute. What I did in Signs and Wonders was kind of focus on what I called photographic subjection. That is the way that photography and how we engage with photography entrains us in certain ways of knowing, doing, seeing, and being. And those ways of knowing, seeing, doing, and being are, this is going back to Foucault, who I told you I wasn't going to talk about, but I'll make it quick, are what he calls a function of biodisciplinary power. And that's a system of carrots and sticks that constitutes modernity, again, back to my fourfold, that encourages us to really, that is really, I would say, responsible for why there are these varying social justice issues. An example would be let's say, as you know, I don't use particular photographs in this book and Seeing and Believing, but I do talk about a particular photographic storyline, right? The storyline that is launched by Trayvon Martin's murder in Florida. Well, if you think about what prompted that man to kill him, George Zimmerman, to kill him, it was seeing a young Black man in a gray hoodie in a white neighborhood, right? So, and the photograph, a selfie of Trayvon Martin that had been made obviously long before that, this murder, became a kind of iconic representation of injustice, right? And so one of the things that we need to do is wrestle with, why do we see, when we see a young Black man in a gray hoodie in a white neighborhood, why do we see him as a potential criminal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an example of how we've been entrained to see in certain ways and thus be and do in certain ways too, right? So that's photographic subjection. What I want to do in Seeing and Believing is turn to what I'm calling photographic insurrection. That is, how can we break with that kind of subjection, the way we've been, trained to see, in ways that that take advantage of the opportunities that social media offers us, in order to become better people, but also to advance the cause of social justice. And some of that would have to do with, okay, what happens if you really look at that selfie of Trayvon Martin? What happens? So to engage in photographic insurrection, we've got to really slow down and look, right? And really look seriously and closely. And things can happen. It can transform us.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So here's another endorsement. This one is from, is it Biko or Biko Mandela Gray?
Biko Mandela Gray.
Biko Mandela Gray, author of Black Life Matter, Blackness, Religion, and the Subject. He says, developing an account of photographic insurrection, Seeing, Believing calls and calls out, attuning us to the ways that our new digital public square can be mobilized toward justice. So what are the ways you suggest that the digital public square can be mobilized for justice?
Well, let me start by telling you about the ways that it's mobilized for injustice, and that will help. We think of we call social media basically our new public square, right? And it's because, we're all on it, for one thing, right? And we all engage in some way, shape, or form on it and in it. And so, and in all kinds of different ways, we engage with friends and family. We engage with people we don't know about political issues sometimes. That's really how many of us get our media too, right, these days. So it's really it really is our new public square. But here's the thing. There's nothing really public about it. It is owned by these giant multinational corporations, right? It's a private square. And what do those giant multinational corporations want? They want our eyes. They want our attention. They want money. They want money. And they get money by grabbing our attention. That then allows them to sell stuff to advertisers and so on and so forth, right? So that as a result, then they tend to show us what we want to see, or at least what they think we want to see. And as a result of that, we end up in what Eli Pariser calls filter bubbles. So these small bubbles where we are surrounded by like-minded people and we don't even realize it, right? So we hear what we are seeing what Facebook, let's say, thinks we want to see. We're engaging with people that Facebook thinks we want to engage with. And that's so that makes it a public square in a very strange and that torques us in certain ways and distorts us in certain ways. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that that this new public square is one of the factors that's really involved in accelerating this sense of political division and this sense of of really occupying very different worlds, right? Very different truth worlds even. I think that's a good bit because of social media. So that's what we're wrestling with, right? That's the reality of our situation. At the same time, there's evidence that social media do provide opportunities for working for social justice, right? One of the books I use is Zeynep Tufekci's book, Twitter and Tear Gas. And it's a really great, great book. She is looking specifically at the Arab Spring and just how important social media organizing was to that event, and in all sorts of ways, particularly because it connected people globally to what was going on in Tahrir Square, et cetera, et cetera. And people contributed things like, medical supplies and food and all kinds of stuff. So there's this one thing we often forget is that our virtual world and our real world are really very interconnected. And we see that when it comes to social organizing. So that's just one example. I mentioned in an earlier question that I'm interested in, that I kind of anchor this book in a photographic storyline that starts with Trayvon Martin. Okay, well, that photographic storyline ends up launching Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Which started out as a hashtag, let's remember, hashtag Black Lives Matter, and became a major global protest movement. And in fact, probably the largest protest movement ever in the history of the world, or at least in the history of the US. And it was people from all over the place, and people of all sorts, of all kinds, of all races, et cetera, all came together in this protest. Now, what that's going to yield, it remains to be seen. That's always the problem, right? Same thing with the Arab Spring. And one of the points that Tufekci makes is that social organizing on social media platforms is no substitute for real life stuff, right? You got to do that. But so that's one thing. The Black Lives Matter movement is one direction of that storyline. But that storyline also goes in another much more troubling direction, which is looking at Trayvon Martin's photograph and trying to figure out and hearing about what happened at that day is what prompted Dylan Roof to get online, Googling, I think, black on black crime, as I recall. And that led to his radicalization as a white supremacist, which led him then to murder 9 people at the Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina. And that in turn motivated, and again, I should back up. And Dylan Roof posted online his manifesto with this really kind of very powerful selfie of himself, in fact. And that motivated a man in New Zealand to essentially do the same thing and murder a whole bunch of people in a mosque and film it live on Facebook and post it. So that's what I'm saying. 2 very, very, very different directions that this storyline can go. And that's because photographs don't move. They all move us. Oftentimes they move us emotionally and to take action, but not necessarily in the same direction. So there's the challenge. How can we navigate this and so that we can make the most of these really great opportunities, but also avoid the worst of avoid the challenges that and the consequences that could come from this platform.
So in the appendix, you offer several ways of seeing. Can you explain what that means and give a couple of examples?
Sure. So one of the things, what I do at the end of the book is I turn to religion as a resource that can help us navigate that. Now, I turn to religion, but very carefully. What I offer are, I guess, a repertoire of visual gazes, of ways of seeing, as you said, that come from Christianity by way of another scholar, the fabulous David Morgan at Duke University. And he gets these from Christianity, but he finds them also in other religious traditions too. And what's most important, I mean, that's important to me for one thing, but what's most important about this visual repertoire is he also says that these are ways of seeing that come naturally to us. That is, they're ways of seeing that all human beings use. All of those who can see, that is, of course, physically, right? Um, and so that's really important for what I'm trying to accomplish here, right? Wouldn't do much good if I came up with ways of seeing that only Christians use, right? Or that only Hindus use, or that only Buddhists use. Um, in fact, it wouldn't be very useful if I came up with ways of seeing that only people of faith used, whatever faith they were. So it's really important that these ways of seeing be be things that come naturally to us, to all of us, regardless of whether we're people of faith or not, who we are or not. And so that's crucial. The other thing is, I think I say this in the book too, that none of these particular ways of seeing directly address any of the social issues we're talking about, right? None of them do. But what they all do, and this is again because they're religious, what they all do is they disrupt the hierarchy of seer over seen that is so much of how we see. Go back to Trayvon Martin again, right? We think we know what Trayvon Martin is, who Trayvon Martin is by seeing this guy in a gray hoodie, right? Black guy in a gray hoodie. So all of these particular ways of seeing disrupt that hierarchy of seer over seen. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one is probably the one that's the most obviously religious. It's the devotional gaze. And the devotional gaze, you basically submit yourself to what you're seeing. An example might be I can't think of the name of the artist who did it, but this very famous painting of Jesus on the cross, kind of lying down, and which can be kind of an icon. And you bring yourself, subject yourself to that as a kind of act of worship in some ways, right? And what that does is then really reverse the order of seer over seen, because you are in some ways acknowledging the power of that photograph over you, the power of that visual object over you. Another one is, I'm trying to think which one. Oh, the aversive way of seeing, which is a really interesting one, I think, where you look around the visual object rather than directly at it. And that's because you want to avoid, whatever it is, you either want to avoid it or you feel like you're not worthy of seeing it, but you look around it and think about how that affects you. Another one is the communal way of seeing. And that one, it's kind of a back and forth between you and the visual object, but it's one where you're attending to the social surroundings that maybe connect you and that visual object, whatever those are. So those are a few examples of the different kind of gazes. Does that help?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Things that I haven't really thought about personally before.
Right.
Different ways of analysis and framing, for photography.
Yeah.
For images.
And here's a particularly interesting thing. I did an experiment with students in my class. I taught a class in theology, visual culture, and whatever, I don't remember, social justice, I think is what I called it. And at the beginning of the class, before we'd read anything, I showed them those two selfies of Trayvon Martin and Dylan Roof. And I asked them to pick one, look at it, spend some time with it, look at it, and write down what they thought, what they felt, how they reacted, how they responded. And then I told them to keep those notes. We come back to them later in the semester. And then at the end of the semester, after we'd read all this stuff, right, including Morgan's book, then I asked them to pull out those notes and see whether any of these gazes fit
mm,
what
mm,
fit the way that they had seen engaged with that first picture. And to a person, they all were able to identify a gaze, one or another of those gazes that did fit, to describe accurately what they saw, which to my mind affirmed that these are indeed gazes that come naturally to us, right? These are gazes we use even when we're not thinking about it.
mhm, mhm.
Then I asked them to do another experiment. I asked them this time to specifically pick another gaze, not the one they used the first time, but a different one, and use it to look at that picture again, that photograph again, and to
Mm.
see what happened. And there again, they all did it. They chose different ones, and wrote about what they saw when they engaged in that with that photograph that way. And it was transformative for them, deepening in some ways, some insights they'd had the first time, changing some of what they saw the second time. It was really, really fascinating. And I write about that in the book too.
Mm, mm,
And I include that list of gazes so that readers can experiment with it themselves,
mhm, mhm.
Um, and that list also has what we call prompts, right, to help you, right? How do I do this?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
you know, to help you, take advantage of this opportunity when it comes your way. So
yeah.
this gives me some optimism, and some assurance that perhaps this really can be a useful tool for us as we're trying to navigate these difficult questions and difficult issues.
It's very fascinating, to kind of delve into the depth that you have around images, and the f-
Hmm.
the framing that it causes us to take. You
Hmm.
know, as
Hmm.
humans, we instantly have to make assumptions, right?
That's right. That's
Around
right.
whatever it is what we're seeing, and
That's right.
a lot of times those are dangerous assumptions.
That's right. And so this is another thing, I think, to go back to social media too, and as our new public square, it is a visually saturated
Mm,
platform, you know.
mhm.
Nothing comes up on my Facebook feed that isn't accompanied by some kind of visual image. Sometimes it's a photograph, sometimes it's a meme, whatever. And we're in an era where, because of the challenges of digital photography in particular, right, we have to worry more and more about the possibility of the visual object we're encountering being fake, for
Yeah,
one thing,
yeah,
right? Um, and, that was always an issue for analog photography too, right? Whether or not that was always a suspicion. But to manipulate analog photography took certain skills and was
yeah.
not something available to everybody. Anybody can, can manipulate a digital photograph. But the thing about digital photography too, and other thing, a digital photograph can actually be made out of whole digital cloth. It doesn't even require an object and a camera,
Right.
you know?
AI.
Yeah. So we've got some major challenges there. So you couple that with the attention economy, right? With the ways that these multinational corporations want to just get us, engaged and get us looking at things. And things that outrage us apparently are the kinds of things that really prompt engagement.
Mhm.
So here's what we got to do. Anytime something out just makes us just want to scream, right? A photograph that just makes us want to scream. And boy, there are a lot of those, right? Or grabs us in some way that makes us even want to cry or makes us just have strong emotional reactions to it. That is an opportunity and a challenge. And we need to slow down, which is not what the social media companies want us to
Yeah.
do. They want us to scroll, scroll,
I
scroll,
mean, if
right?
anything, human nature is causing our attention span to be less
Hmm.
over what it used to be.
That's right. That's
So we're
exactly
not
right.
slowing down.
No, that's right. That's right. So that's why I'm saying we really have some big challenges here
Mhm,
that we've
mhm,
got to kind of unpack and deal with. So the first trick is to slow down
mhm,
and to really look at what we're seeing in that photograph. Part of that involves doing our due diligence as best we can. Can I trust this site? Can I trust,
mhm.
what's up here? But part of that too is not just worrying about the truth of a photograph, right? Whether it actually represents accurately some that then there, that out there, but also really dealing with the way photographs move us emotionally and to take action. And so to kind of pause, think about what's going on here. What is it about this photograph that's moving us? And why is that moving us? And what
Mm,
can I learn from that?
mm,
What can I, and what should I do if I do need to do something? You
mm.
know?
Wow. So
Yeah.
this has really been fascinating. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I'm trying to think. I think I pretty much covered everything that I really, really wanted to say. So no, I think we're good.
Good, good. So my last question, any future projects that you're working on that you want to share anything about? Too early?
Well, I'll share a past, yeah, I'll share a past project and then kind of where I think I'm going in terms of a future project. I have an article that I wrote too about, I mean, it's it kind of thinking about a different photograph and the different opportunity that it proposed to us. And you may remember the photograph of Alan Kurdi, a young Syrian boy who had died and his body washed up
Oh,
on the
right.
beach in Turkey,
Yes.
right? Um, yeah, um, and I write about that too, because that's another example it's an interesting example to think about because um, that was a photograph actually taken by a fellow soldier of I think it might have been taken by a journalist. No, I don't think so. I think it was somebody who was there just who witnessed it. Um, and that photograph was picked up by the press, right? Globally and circulated globally, as well as on social media. And it was after it was picked up on social media that the press saw it. And that's another dynamic we have to
Mhm,
wrestle with too,
mhm,
right? Um, and that photograph actually mobilized a lot of people to take action on behalf of Syrian
mm,
refugees.
mm,
And again, concrete action on behalf of Syrian refugees, particularly in Canada and in Europe. So it's just, I guess what I'm saying is what I'm thinking I want to do at this point is kind of what I did there. I I expanded I went a different direction, dealing with a different issue. In this case, whereas my focus in seeing and believing is on that particular photographic storyline that figures prominent, in which racism figures particularly prominently. Um, that one, it was immigration and the refugee crisis and the climate crisis and so on, right? Um, and what I'm thinking I'm going to do next is focus on trans issues now,
mm.
since that's such a
Sure.
big issue. Um, and it's kind of personal for me because Vanderbilt, where I work, the medical center was targeted by right-wing folks
Mm,
because it has a gender affirming care clinic. And there were men who came to our campus, and harassed a couple of our students who they perceived to be trans and who
mm,
were. I had colleagues who received death threats
mm,
because of the work that they had done. I had with the clinic, I had other students too who worked for the clinic who also received death threats.
mm,
So this is really, personal to me. And I think again gets at this issue of, political division is one thing, violence is another thing, I guess. And the fact that people feel they can enforce their political views by vigilante violence, I think is really a terrifying situation that we're confronting today. So for that reason, I think I want to look at the issue of how we see gender, how we see
mm,
trans
mm,
people. And of course, that's not separable from race because, trans people of color are the ones, especially trans women of color, are the most vulnerable to murder and to abuse and so on.
mm,
So I think I want to look at that. But I want again I'm thinking right now I may look at art photography,
mm.
moving away from social media a bit, but looking at art photography as examples of, slow down and look. And that particular care with which visual artists, photographic artists do their work is, I think, really important. And again, speaks to, it's not new. I talk a lot about iconic photographs and Seeing and Believing and in Signs and Wonders. And an example of an iconic photograph is Migrant Mother, which you'll probably, even just telling you the name, you might remember. It's a photograph of a Depression era woman, a white
Yeah, yeah,
Depression
yeah.
era woman,
Mm-hmm.
taken by Dorothy Lang, right, holding her
Mm-hmm.
baby and just very pensive. And that photograph was credited with generating more support for the New Deal. So artistic photographs have their place, and can really move us in particular ways. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of, and doing a little bit more in terms of seeing and perception as an embodied practice, not just a visual one, but a more embodied one. So see, that's what I'm thinking right now. Ask
Wow.
me next week, it could change.
Very cool. Well, that's exciting. You have to stay in touch with us and let us know when that comes out. For now, the new book is Seeing and
I
Believing,
will.
Religion, Digital Visual Culture, and Social Justice. Ellen, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for all the work that you're doing, and congratulations on it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.